It's no secret that I am deeply fascinated by games like this. You know, niche games with some really interesting history, a story to tell, and man, Epic Mickey is definitely one of those games. So, where else to start with a game like this than immersive sims? More specifically, the man who helped create the genre. Warren Spector is a name some of you might not recognize either because you're too young or you're just not into immersive sims, but I promise you, the games he worked on were not only some of the most influential games of all time, but they're specifically relevant to Epic Mickey because of their shared DNA. A lot of this game's mechanics and structure are very similar to that of immersive sims Warren Spector did work for, most notably its morality system, which we'll talk more about when I get into the gameplay proper later. This makes sense because if it weren't obvious by now, Warren Spector was incredibly important to the creation of Epic Mickey, being the game's director. Although, that's interestingly not where Epic Mickey's development history starts. Hell, Warren didn't even get involved until sometime in 2007. No, Epic Mickey technically started its history much earlier, in 2003. I say technically because, well, it didn't really start then. It might have if it weren't for a little bunny-shaped problem. Let's talk about Oswald the Lucky Rabbit for a second. Oswald was one of Walt Disney's and iWorks' first ever character designs to be seen in an animated short and hit it big. Although this was when Walt's studio was working for Universal, and because he and his crew had created Oswald under them, the Lucky Rabbit was owned by Universal. At some point later, though, Walt had enough of working for them after his own studio grew while working on those Oswald shorts. He also invested in digging up oil with his brother. The 1920s were a weird time, man. More importantly, he, alongside iWorks, went on to create one of the most well-known media characters of all time, one that he would keep the rights to. And in 1928, Steamboat Plain Crazy was created, the real first Mickey Mouse short. Yeah, this is gonna be a weird tangent, but believe it or not, Steamboat Willie was never the first Mickey Mouse short, it was Plain Crazy. Steamboat Willie was just released first. Hell, it wasn't even the second Mickey Mouse short, it was the third. I assume modern Disney uses Steamboat Willie more because it was both the first Mickey Mouse short released and it was also the first short with sound, but more importantly, it's just the most iconic Mickey short of all time, bar none. Now, back to the topic at hand, we're gonna fast forward by quite a bit back to the 2000s. In 2006, Bob Iger, then and still current CEO of Disney, made a surprising move. He sold a man for a rabbit. I mean, not really, that's a very simple way of looking at it, but it still did kind of happen. At the time, Al Michaels, while working for ESPN, a subsidiary of Disney, expressed interest in moving to NBC Universal. He was under contract with ESPN at the time, which meant he couldn't work for them, obviously, until Bob Iger saw an opportunity to get back one of Walt's first major works in the industry. Disney negotiated with Universal that they get Disney's Sportsman in return for the rights to the Lucky Rabbit and all 27 shorts that Walt and his crew had worked on involving the character. The reason Iger wanted the character back so bad? Well, we're gonna go back to 2003 for a quick sec. You see, 2003 was when Epic Mickey was pitched directly to Bob Iger, who at the time was not the CEO of Disney. He was still high up in the company, but there's not much he could have done about the fact that Disney didn't own Oswald at the time. So of course, what does he do when he becomes CEO in 2005? He makes it one of his duties to get that fucking rabbit back. I feel the need to say at this point that all of this shit that I've said so far is true. And now, we're back to 2007, where Disney bought Warren Spector's game company, Junction Point Studios. And finally, after all of that, the game is put into production with Warren Spector as director. But we're still not done with this part yet, are we? No. You see, Epic Mickey was originally intended for Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, but not the Wii. Of course, we live in this reality where the Wii version is the only version of the game. The reason for this is, in an abridged version of Warren Spector's own words, a port of the PS3, PC, and Xbox version just wouldn't work on the Wii. If the Wii was getting an Epic Mickey game, it was going to be its own game. Eventually, Graham Hopper, I think executive for Disney's video game publishing company, who I can find barely any information about, suggested just making the game a Wii exclusive, and the rest is history. Probably for the best, because based on Epic Mickey 2, the pointer controls probably would have sucked ass on anything but the Wii. Anyway, I'm done with this part of the video now. There's probably some more things to talk about with the game's development, but this was really the stuff I wanted to talk about in this section. Hell, if you're watching this video, you probably already knew most of this shit, but I feel it's important to bring up in relation to the game itself. With that said, let's move on. Epic Mickey's story and writing is its best aspect, which is why I'm not going to talk about it just yet. I want to talk about a couple of other things first before I just gush about that part. And I think there's no better place to start than with how this game looks and just its presentation overall. While it is very much graphically a Wii game, I still like to think that its aesthetics hold up fairly well. One of the best examples of this is easily Mickey Junk Mountain, an area that you get to fairly early on in the game. Just conceptually, this area is really clever, and it's also genuinely pretty cool to look at. The entire location is made out of old Mickey memorabilia in this absolutely huge pile. And it's all real-world Mickey merchandise too. Bobbleheads, tin toys, NES and SNES games, guitars, clocks, lunchboxes, there's just so much of it here. And this is only a fraction of what this game has to offer visually. There are these 2D sections where you play through old Mickey shorts, and each one has multiple visual references to the short it's based on. And there are a ton of them, based off of some of that Mouse's best shorts. Which, speaking of those shorts, this is gonna be a bit of a tangent, sorry. While working on this video, I got the idea to make a little mini-series where I talk about every Mickey Mouse short ever made. Not every Disney short, mind you, just the ones focusing on Mickey himself. I don't know when or if that'll happen, but keep an eye out, who knows. Actually, that kind of transitions well to talking about Epic Mickey's cutscenes. A good chunk of them are 2D animated, and they look stellar. I absolutely love the color choices here, and the shading style is so unique to anything I've seen in 2D animation before. It's very stylistically striking and very memorable. The in-game cutscenes aren't much to write home about though, pretty standard for this kind of thing, they get the job done. At least you get to look at these tasty, tasty character designs during them. Whoever was in charge of these designs really knew what they were doing. Mickey himself especially looks fantastic. His design in this game pulls from his classic late black and white, early color days while still feeling distinct in its own. This is probably my second favorite design for Mickey, right behind the Paul Rudish version. Of course, Mickey's not the only one who got a bit of a glow up. There's a lot of old, classic Disney shorts characters here, like Horace Horsecollar, Clarabelle, or of course the man of the hour, Oswald. All of which that have gotten incredibly solid designs in this game. And don't get me started on the Pete's either, anything that's a direct reference to Tron is good in my book. Pete being here does bring up a sort of awkward question about the game's lore, though. So the reason all these classical Disney characters are in this place, Wasteland, is because they're either forgotten characters or unused versions of them. Which is all fine and dandy until characters like Pete, Smee, and hell even Horace and Clarabelle are brought into the equation. Everyone knows who Pegleg Pete is, no matter what costume you put him in, and most people who've seen Peter Pan, and that's a lot of people, remember Smee being Captain Hook's first mate. And, while not as well known, Clarabelle and Horace were both still showing up in Mickey-related stuff not too long before Epic Mickey came out. Now, you could make an argument for the first thing that they're old, unused versions of the characters, but no, they're not. That part of it was most likely just an excuse to have some more recognizable Disney characters in the game, which, yeah, fair. As for Clarabelle and Horace, you could make a convincing argument that even though they still showed up in Disney shows and movies only a little bit before Epic Mickey, that doesn't mean most people remember them. Also, I don't know why I got caught up on this, it does not matter. Although, bringing that aspect up does give me a chance to talk about some actually really forgotten characters. Let's talk about the Gremlins for a second, and no, not those ones. The Gremlins was a children's book written by Roald Dahl, who, for those of you that might be too young to know the name, was a man people my age and older know for writing books like The Big Friendly Giant and, more notably, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. The Gremlins was a tie-in book to a movie that was being worked on by Roald Dahl and Disney, the company, in the 1940s. Things fell through, and all we have to show for it in the modern day is the book, obviously, but also Epic Mickey. Being forgotten characters, the Gremlins are in the game too, and they're the ones that keep Wasteland in check, making sure it doesn't fall into disrepair. Well, more disrepair. One of them is even a main character joining you for your entire journey, a gremlin named Gus. And finally, on that note, we're going to get into this game's story. A long time ago, in universe not real life, Mickey steps through his mirror and ends up in the home of the wizard Yen Sid, the same wizard from the short The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Mickey, wildly messing with Yen Sid's magical paintbrush, accidentally creates the game's main villain, the Blot, and then tries to use thinner on it, which not only makes the Blot more powerful, but also ruins the world Yen Sid had created for forgotten cartoon characters, like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Hearing Yen Sid returning, and knowing he's messed up, Mickey scrambles back through the mirror to his home, and from there, we see time pass, referencing multiple classic Mickey shorts while doing so, even implying that the prior event happened before The Sorcerer's Apprentice. After said time had passed, Mickey wakes up to see the very monster he created, the Blot, pull him into the world he helped to almost destroy, into Wasteland. and from here on, it's up to Mickey to set the mistakes of his past right, eventually meeting up with Gus, and then later, Oswald. And man, while the plot itself is interesting enough to get you invested from the beginning, it is the character moments, especially the ones between Mickey and Oswald, that sell this fucking story. Mickey, once he gets to Wasteland, realizes quickly why this place is the way that it is, and as a result of that, feels incredibly guilty and that it's his responsibility to make things right. Whereas Oswald is just incredibly bitter and resentful towards Mickey, believing him to be the reason Oswald was forgotten. Gus is also just kinda there. Not to say he's not fun as a character, he's mostly comic relief, but most of the focus is on Mickey and Oswald's dynamic. There are two really good scenes in particular that show both these aspects of their characters and also just their dynamic and how it evolves as the game goes on. The first is where after defeating what you believe to be the Blot, it's revealed that it was just a small fry and the real Blot is trapped inside a bottle of paint thinner, the very same one Mickey spilled into Wasteland all those years ago. It's after you get to the bottle that Oswald tries to make amends for the way he's acted up to this point, as well as apologizing for his clear resentment with Mickey, offering a handshake and a fresh start. Mickey reaches in for it before wrenching his hand back to the shock of both Oswald and Gus, and reveals that it was him that caused the appropriately named thinner disaster. Oswald reacts about the way you'd expect him to, which, you know, fair, but in doing so, he accidentally releases the real Blot by destroying the cork from the thinner bottle in his hot-headed anger. This leads pretty cleanly into the other scene I wanted to talk about where, after devising a way to deal with the real Blot once and for all, Oswald finally comes to terms with the fact that the thinner disaster was really just an accident, and sees that Mickey really does want to atone for what he did. He reaches for another handshake, and this time, they still don't get to shake because Oswald is grabbed by the Blot before they can. Whoops. These two scenes in particular are really good at showing off the relationship between our two leads. The ups and downs they go through, it all feels so natural. There's another scene much earlier on in the game that not only shows off more of that aspect, but also boasts this game's excellent moments of silent storytelling. When Mickey first meets Oswald, it doesn't go super well, but they all figure out that they can get back to the real world in a rocket that's in what is essentially Disney World's Space Mountain mixed with Disneyland's Tomorrowland. Only problem is, Gus brings up that Oswald and himself can't go to the real world because they don't have hearts, and you can only have a heart in Wasteland if people remember you. Without saying anything, we know exactly what Oswald is thinking. He plans to steal Mickey's heart. And as the game goes on, you can clearly see Oswald warm up to Mickey more and more until at the very end, when Oswald has the chance to take the heart for himself, he hands it back to Mickey because he knows it's the right thing to do. And so much of that stuff is said without any dialogue too. This game's writing really respects the hell out of you as a viewer? Player, whatever. It never feels cheap, and every emotional moment between Mickey and Oswald feels so earned. And of course, I've mostly been talking about Oswald here, but Mickey himself is probably the best he's ever been in this game. A mistake from his past forces him to confront the less than stellar version of himself from back then as the Mickey he is now, the Mickey we all know now. It turned a character that had, over the years, changed simply to fit a different role in his shorts, into a character that now had long-lasting, actual, bona fide character development. He can fall back into that older, mischievous side of himself and indulge in it, or he can do what's right and help all the people in Wasteland that he hurt to the best of his ability. Which kinda doesn't work super well due to the game's morality system. We'll get more into that later, but at the very least, conceptually, the idea is very investing story-wise. I actually have a little story from when I first played the game where I accidentally went with the bad route, the thinner route, on the first boss because I didn't have a full grasp on how the game worked yet, and I felt bad about it after I did. It was kind of poignant with the game's themes of recognizing your mistakes and either doing nothing to fix them, or doing your best to make up for them. I don't know if that feeling was intentional because, well, again, we'll get to that later. Moving on, I want to bring up the real-world inspiration for Oswald and Mickey's dynamic in this game, and it's just a little drawing from Walt himself of Mickey waving to Oswald and Oswald looking annoyed. That, what is essentially a doodle, was basically what set the groundwork for the story of this game, and more importantly, the character writing. Just goes to show that great ideas can come from the simplest of places. I also genuinely couldn't, and still kind of can't, believe how well written this game is. When I was done with my first playthrough, before I had even decided to make this video, I was blown away by how invested I was, by how well executed it all was. I knew by the game's end, I had to talk about it. It's just such an outstanding story that I knew I had to say something, even though plenty of others had done the same before me. I just had to get it out of my system, and I'd say I've done that now, although I feel like I'm still not done. I wonder why. Oh, right. Ducktales! That's right, that's the thing I was forgetting. Definitely. Well, I'm not stalling, what do you mean? I just definitely wanted to talk about the Ducktales remaster. There's no ulterior motive here. Anyway, where to start with this one? It's actually really hard to pick. I love just about every aspect of this game. I guess it would make sense to talk about the original a little first though, huh? The original NES game is quaint. It's not too difficult, it's very short, and I think it looks quite nice for the time. The sprites for all the characters are very adorable, even. The color palette's a little rough, but it was the NES, what can you do? Oh, well, I guess you could make a full-on remake with outstanding animation quality, phenomenal lighting, and some really good color choices. That's what you can do. For real though, this game is gorgeous. The only downside visually is that it's from the PS3 era, so the textures are a little lower quality than I'd like them to be. Stylistically though, this is fucking breathtaking. It might not look impressive to some of you, but knowing that every single frame of movement for every single character, and there are a lot of characters in this, had to be done one frame at a time with no tweens for all of them is just mind-blowing for a video game. There's a couple of reasons you don't see this kind of thing that often in games. 2D animation is both very time-consuming and very expensive, which, for companies like Disney and Capcom, they can probably afford to take the hit. I'm genuinely impressed when I see this kind of thing in indie titles like Hollow Knight. It's a hell of an undertaking. And of course, the visuals aren't the only thing this version does better. No, that'd be doing it a disservice, I think. This remake, remaster, whatever the fuck you want to call it, improves upon just about every aspect of the original. There are various quality of life improvements like having the pogo on a separate button, or small level design changes that help them to be more balanced and flow better, or having multiple difficulties depending on what you're comfortable with. And you didn't think I was gonna forget about this game's stellar fucking soundtrack, did you? The original NES versions of these tracks are pretty solid and very catchy, especially if you enjoy chiptune from time to time like I do, but holy shit dude, the remastered tracks are on a whole different level. And I know everyone loves the moon theme, but my personal favorite track is the Amazon. I just really like the vibe behind it. Of course, the moon theme is still absolutely fantastic. I'm not even gonna pretend it's not. While we're on the audio side of things, there's full-on voice acting from almost the entire cast of the original series. It's thanks to that aspect specifically that makes it feel like you're playing an episode of the show. It's insanely charming.
Looks like the key's missing. You don't think the ghost ran off with it, do ya?
Look, if I hear one more word about this mine being haunted, I'll start haunting it myself.
Although Scrooge and especially Magica sound way older than they used to, you can really tell it's been a long time since the original series for Alan Young and June Foray, respectively.
No, I had Beetle Boys hide paper scraps to throw you off trail.
Why, you sneaky, conniving...
Please.
This was even the second to last of Alan Young's performances, not just as Scrooge, but in general, before his passing. Alan and June had quite the acting careers. They were both incredibly talented, and it was nice to hear them in this, even though it was both one of their last roles. On a lighter note, Ducktales Remastered is just undoubtedly charming. I have little to nothing to complain about. This is a rarity for me, even for my favorite game of all time, which I'm not disclosing here for a possible future video. I still have problems with it, but I just can't think of anything that actively bothered me with this one. This game is just a really tightly made 2D platformer with a great pace, plenty of fan service, and it's overall just a love letter to the show it was based on. And I suppose on that note, I should get to... Alright, you caught me. I was 100% stalling with that DuckTales review. And I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, and I'm sorry, Warren, if you ever see this. You probably won't, but still, I know you're proud of this game, and I'd say you should be, but the gameplay is easily the worst part of it. And it's not terrible, sometimes, but man, does it leave a lot to be desired. There are some really interesting mechanics here. The paintbrush especially is a genuinely really cool concept that I feel doesn't get used very well. The paintbrush can shoot out both paint and thinner. One fills things in and the other the opposite. You use paint or thinner for three main things: exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. The problem comes from all three of these things never really evolving past their initial introductions. For puzzle solving, if you see something blocking your way, you use thinner to get rid of it. If you see a gear slot or something like that that's clearly missing something, you fill it in with paint. Later on, you do get items for puzzle solving, but this never really gets much deeper either. It almost always just ends up as putting one of these items on a button and then something happens. For combat, you shoot an enemy for long enough with either thinner or paint until they either die or befriend you respectively, and that's it. I can think of both one enemy and one enemy type that somewhat somewhat evolved this idea, but they're both just kind of annoying to fight. The first is one of the Blotlings enemy type. You can use paint or thinner on these guys. It's called a slobber, and to beat it you have to shoot thinner or paint into its open mouth when it's doing a specific attack. Which is kinda neat, except they're usually in fairly cramped arenas and take too long to actually defeat, which leads to them being more generally irritating than anything. The second one is just an entire enemy type called the Beetleworks. You can only use thinner on these guys to remove their armor. Then you use your normal attack to beat them. They can't be befriended. Just like the Slobber, a good idea in theory, but frustrating in practice. They're usually some of the toughest enemies in the game, and of course they love throwing a million of them at you as the game goes on. The worst part of the game I can think of is terrible specifically because of these enemies. At one point near the end of the game you have to fight the Mad Doctor, who I just realized I haven't brought up the whole video. He's like one of the main antagonists, but he's barely in the game. He does not matter, trust me. Anyway, you're not actually fighting him, you're just destroying his stuff. The problematic part comes around when you have to fight some of the toughest Beetleworks in the game, 3-on-1 to beat the boss. To be fair, you only have to do this when you're using thinner, but god, it's still not fun. And of course, they're not tough but fair. No, they and pretty much every enemy in the game just have awkward hitboxes with attacks that are annoying to dodge. They're not even that distinct outside of anything but their appearance. You fight them all the same way. Dodge attacks, shoot with thinner, hit weak point, repeat until dead. And finally, onto the last thing you use the brush for, exploration. This is probably the brush's best use, at least for me, usually because it ties more into the platforming aspect. Which isn't to say that it's all that special, it usually just consists of using thinner to remove hidden walls, or using paint to create platforms. All of this, the combat, the exploration, and the puzzle solving, it's just a letdown. Oh, right, I guess there is one more thing tied to the brush. That being the game's morality system, which to me is Epic Mickey's biggest disappointment. This is a hard one to talk about, because Junction Point had some crazy ambitious ideas for this game, for the morality system especially, that got cut. My favorite cut idea easily being Mickey's physical transformation depending on whether you did good and used paint or did bad and used thinner. Not only showing how much damage you're doing to the world if you do bad, but the damage you're doing to yourself too. I'm not necessarily upset that this particular idea got cut, but the game's current morality system has essentially no bearing on anything and leaves a lot to be desired. It barely affects the gameplay, the visuals, or the story in any meaningful way. There's not even multiple endings. The game will always treat you like the good guy at the end, whether you actually did much good or not. And the concept behind the morality system is genuinely really cool, building off of how Mickey as a character in his shorts grew over time. Starting as a little shit who could be jealous, who stole, who could sometimes just be downright mean, to becoming what we all know today, the kind, caring, and wholesome Mickey Mouse. The bad path was meant to be Mickey falling into his old ways, whereas the good path was Mickey continuing to be the kind and true hero we all know him as. But neither path really means anything in the end, since they both lead to the same thing. I think Epic Mickey would have been better off, as it is now at least, without this morality system in the first place. Not to mention, the morality system is directly tied to how much paint or thinner you get throughout the game, and it can lead to some annoying moments where you need one or the other, but you have significantly less of one than the other. Overall, it's just kind of a mess, and we're not even done yet. There's some more I want to talk about with the gameplay, and unfortunately, most of it isn't much better off. Things like 100% in the game really isn't worth it because you have to play the game from start to finish multiple times to do it. Or the constant backtracking for side quests that never really amount to anything besides some minor things changing in the final cutscene of the game. Or when they're no longer side quests and become mandatory, which is again made worse by the backtracking and also just straight up feels like padding. Or the 2D segments based on old Mickey shorts that are cool at first, but because of that fucking backtracking again, you have to go through them over and over. Or, and I'm sorry, if you knew anything about this game, you knew this was coming, but the fucking camera is awful. I hate bringing this up because it's one of the big things everyone talks about when they're discussing this game, and because it's something Warren Spector is outspokenly annoyed by when people bring it up, but man, it's as bad as everyone says it is. It's not terrible at first, but as the game goes on and the environments become more cramped, you really have to fight the goddamn thing to get it to cooperate with you. And man, I despise talking this negatively about things I like, and yeah, this might surprise you to hear at this point, but I still really like this game. But I'm sorry, I can't in good faith ignore all the things that I actively dislike about it. They do really just bring the experience down, which makes me kinda sad. I'd even go as far to say that Epic Mickey is more interesting and fun to talk about than it is to actually play it. But, like I said earlier, not everything about the gameplay is terrible, and that's thanks to at least two things I haven't brought up yet. The first is the platforming, which can actually be really fun a lot of the time. It doesn't have the most in-depth platforming mechanics, you only have a simple double jump at your disposal, but the level design is generally challenging enough and fun to jump around on. And it's pretty cool to create the platforms right underneath your feet. The other thing is the boss fights. All well, almost all of these, are genuinely just straight up good. I know I already brought up the Mad Doctor fight, but God. Just God. They're a fair challenge and get you using your noggin fairly often. Not the best 3D platformer bosses, but still pretty solid. Yeah, I'll give Epic Mickey that. Its 3D platforming aspect and its boss fights were enough to have at least kept me invested into the game's best aspects like its story and characters. That alone doesn't make up for all of the game's lost potential in my eyes, but at least it helps the experience as is be less of a slog than it otherwise could have been. It is a shame though I didn't have much more positive to say about the other gameplay aspects. I do genuinely try to be more outwardly positive about the games I discuss here despite their problems, because I think it's a lot more valuable to see what does work in otherwise strange, not traditionally great games than what doesn't work. But sometimes it's just more unavoidable than I'd like it to be. I still love this game, I think. It has a lot of not only good, but genuinely great stuff going for it, just not the game part, you know? Also, before we hit the end, I guess I should mention why, unlike, say, my TAC video, which you should fucking watch, by the way, where I brought up all 3 games in just that one single vid, that the reason I didn't talk about Epic Mickey 2 or the 3DS game is that, well, the second game is just bad to me. It has some nice improvements gameplay-wise, but not enough to really write home about, and the story and presentation take a really big hit in the quality department. I hope if they ever make another Epic Mickey game, they just pretend 2 didn't even happen. I think that'd be the best for everyone involved. And as for the 3DS game, I straight up just haven't played it. It looks like a worse and kinda boring version of the original Castle of Illusion, which if you're playing any version of that, you should really just be playing the remake for it, which improves the visuals and gameplay similarly to the Ducktales remake. Speaking of which, I would honestly love to see a remake, and I mean true remake, Resident Evil 2 style, for Epic Mickey. Basically, I want a remake that takes a lot of the game's best ideas, like its phenomenal story and writing, etc., and puts them into an essentially new game built from the ground up. A new game that properly utilizes the ideas the original had, instead of those ideas being half-baked due to time crunch or executive meddling or whatever else happened behind the scenes. But I suppose I should be more realistic and at least hope for a remaster that cleans up this version of the game. Maybe speed up combat a little bit and especially make that camera better. As it is now though, Epic Mickey was an incredibly ambitious game and a clear passion project for so many of the people that worked on it. A game that needed more time in the oven, a game that was imperfect in a way that wasn't frustrating enough to call bad, and was interesting enough to at least keep it rattling around in my head ever since I first played it. A game that flew too close to the sun, if you will.